All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm Ben Kunkel, Director of Student Programs at the Ashbrook Center, and welcome to our seventh in this series of spring webinars on defining moments of the 20th century. As always, we've got two technical assistants on hand who can help you if you have any problems with the WebEx platform. And as we get started, please feel free to submit questions for the professors using the Q&A section in WebEx, and they'll try to answer them all as they go along. Subject of today's program is women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment, and we're joined today by two Ashland University professors, Dr. Chris Burkett and Dr. Cara Rogers. You guys ready to go?
Sure. Happy to be here. Cara, I think you're muted.
There we go.
There we go.
Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you all to get to discuss why women get to vote today, basically. We're 100 years out from the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, making it so that states cannot discriminate against women on the basis of their gender. And today we get to talk about two documents that are giving us this fascinating snapshot of a moment in time, a moment of this debate that occurred in 1910. It's maybe not one of the most talked about parts of the women's suffrage movement. Normally, when we talk about women's suffrage, we talk about 1920 or we talk about 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention. But 1910 is a fascinating time to drop in on and take a look at what they were discussing then. So it's going to be my pleasure to give everybody some background information on the women's suffrage movement. I'm going to take us back in time and talk us through the history of the suffrage movement. And then I'm going to talk from the perspective of Lyman Abbott. I'm going to introduce his document and discuss some of the major things that he argues. And then Dr. Burkett is going to argue or present the arguments rather of Jane Addams. And then we'll have some time to take questions from all of you who are reading these documents with us. So let me kick it off by going back to the American Revolution. This is where I like to start all of my classes. It's one of my favorite time periods in American history. And I think it's an important moment in time to look at when we're talking about women and voting, because right from the start of America, that has been an interesting debate that people have taken a lot of different perspectives on. The Revolutionary War changed attitudes toward women quite drastically. Previously, women were considered to be important in the household sphere, and that was pretty much it. But the Revolutionary War politicized women in a new way, and it taught a lot of people that women needed to be involved in the Republican process, not by voting so much, but by raising children to have Republican values, to give them a good civic education, to make them virtuous, and that women also had a role in keeping their men virtuous and keeping their men moral. So we call this now, looking backward, the movement toward Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood was this ideology that women in a republic had an important role to play as wives and as mothers, as keepers of virtue, producing good civic citizens. And so this is one huge change that happens at the beginning of the American Revolution, or at the beginning of the American Republic. And then there's also a small group of people in the early republic who went the opposite direction and said, not only do we like the idea of Republican motherhood, but hey, maybe we should just let women vote. New Jersey allowed women to vote until 1807. There's a fun story about this, that women who had enough property in New Jersey were able to vote until 1807, and then some men messed it up for them by voting once, going home, putting on dresses, coming back and voting again. So the legislature of New Jersey changed the law to make it so that women couldn't vote in New Jersey or any of the other states. So this is the conflict at the time of the founding in the early republic. Should we let women vote, or should they just be Republican mothers virtuously guiding us from behind the scenes? Well, the women's suffrage movement really gets its major kickoff in 1848. This is when major figures like Susan B. Anthony had this meeting at Seneca Falls to discuss women's suffrage, and they put forth a declaration of women's rights. And they argue that women are essentially equal with men. In fact, they requote the Declaration of Independence. God created men equal and women equal. And Frederick Douglass, the famous Black abolitionist, is there with them, agreeing with them, saying, yes, just like Black men should be able to vote, so should all women be able to vote because we're all equal. After the Civil War, Congress passed and the states ratified the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which declares that if you're born or you're naturalized in America, you're a citizen and you're entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizenship. So in 1872, Susan B. Anthony, the suffragette, so she was fighting for women's voting rights, decided to test out the 14th Amendment. She walked into a voter registration office in New York and demanded to be registered to vote. And the man sitting behind the counter said, of course not, you can't vote, you're a woman. And she said, well, 14th Amendment, I'm a citizen, therefore I have all the privileges and immunities of citizenship. You have to let me vote or I'm going to sue you. Classic American argument. I will sue you. And it worked. The man behind the registration counter was terrified at the idea of being sued, and so he let her register to vote, and she cast her ballot in that election. And the next day, federal marshals showed up at her house and arrested her. And Susan B. Anthony went on trial. And unfortunately, her trial didn't go so well for Susan B. Anthony. The judge had decided ahead of time he was not even going to let the jury deliberate. He had decided that she could not vote, that it was an illegitimate action, that she'd broken the law. The way that he put it was the 14th Amendment did not give women the right to vote. For him, it was very simple and clear. Now, as the 19th century drew to a close, the women's rights movement turned away from the argument of the Seneca Falls Convention. Women should be allowed to vote because women are equal to men. And unfortunately, in large part, women decided to leave that argument behind because they were moving away from the idea that Black people and white people are equal. In the southern states, governments were discriminating more and more against Black people. Black men were being disenfranchised and prevented from voting. And white women's groups, in order to keep the support of white men, started to turn away from arguing for universal equality and universal voting rights and started to deny access to women's groups to any Black women, and to argue that white women should be allowed to vote in order to keep Black people from being able to have any political power, in order to shore up white supremacy. Now, not all suffragettes agreed with this strategy. Jane Addams, who we're reading for today, she was one of the founding members of the NAACP, the Black rights movement. But a lot of white women did turn in that direction. So they needed to find a new argument on which to base their claim to be able to vote. And they found it, surprisingly enough, by appealing to the Women Christian Temperance Union. This is one of the largest largest women's groups of the 19th century. They were often Midwestern, kind of more rural, housewives, very religious in their outlook, rather conservative socially. These were women who were worried about prostitution, they were worried about obscenity, and mostly they were worried about their husbands getting drunk. The Women's Christian Temperance Union wanted to stop men drinking all the time. And they really wanted this because if a man became an alcoholic in that day and age, and he was no longer able to support his wife or children, the wife really had no options. This could be very devastating to her family, and the law said wives were not allowed to keep the money that they earned. They had to give that to their husbands when they got married. So a man who has an alcohol addiction can literally drink away all of the family money, and wives are seeing their children maybe being abused, maybe going hungry, and they're powerless to do anything about this. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union became great allies of the women's suffrage movement. And together they argued that women needed to be able to vote because there were just some issues that men did not understand and could not properly represent women regarding. And in particular, they're thinking in terms of temperance or the sale of alcohol, and things like prostitution and other kind of conservative social movement issues. Now, by the progressive era in the early 1900s, the Women's Christian Temperance Union had moved away from suffrage and they were focusing their attention on other things. But their strategy was still very influential for a lot of women's rights activists. suffragette leaders in the early 1900s started to, or continued to argue that women had a unique perspective that men couldn't have, and that women needed to be able to step outside of their homes in order to vote so that they could protect their homes, so that they could protect their children, so that they could deal with issues like the problems of life in the inner city, child labor laws, and they even spoke in terms of women needing to clean up corruption, that the male political sphere had maybe become a little bit dirty, a little bit corrupt, a little bit greedy, and that women could have a moderating influence in that. So this brings us to today. The documents that we read are both from 1910. 1910 was a big year for women's rights because the state of Washington changed its constitution so that women were allowed to vote. And the debate became very public and visible, and lots of people started talking about, do we want women to have the vote nationally or not? The national level, women were not having a lot of success yet in 1910, but on a state-by-state level, and particularly out west, women were seeing some constitutions change to allow women to vote. In the South, racism was still a major obstacle to women getting the vote, and the concern was if women were allowed to vote, then what about Black men, or what about Black women being able to vote? A lot of men were afraid of opening the door to those things, so they preferred to keep women out of the political sphere. And in northeastern states, some opposition was coming from factory interests, people who didn't want women to be able to change labor laws and maybe reduce factory productivity or make it more difficult to pay low wages. Now this brings us to Lyman Abbott. So Lyman Abbott was one of the most influential Protestant ministers of his age. He was born in Massachusetts and was trained first as a lawyer and then as a pastor. And he went out to the Midwest during the Civil War and was on the side of the Union after the war ended. He was working with the Freedmen's Bureau to attempt to help freed slaves. He became the pastor of a church, and then he became a very influential newspaper and magazine editor, and he wrote a number of very important books. His sermons were very famous. He was a pastor of a very well-respected church. And the interesting thing about Lyman Abbott is that he really wanted to be a moderate. He chose a moderate path on just about every issue. He was an evolutionist, so he was attempting to reconcile science and Christianity. So he was an evolutionist, but he was never a Darwinist. He wouldn't have gone that far. He was a religious liberal, but he wasn't an agnostic. He was anti-slavery, but he wasn't an abolitionist. He was an industrial Democrat, but he wasn't a socialist. And in the document that we read today, we see he really tried to be moderate on the issue of women's suffrage as well. So I'm just going to walk us through some of the most important things that Lyman Abbott says in this document. And I think the very first paragraph, he tells us straight off the bat, I am a moderate on this issue. I am not somebody who believes that women are inferior to men. In fact, he tells us right away that he used to be a fan of women's suffrage. He understands the perspective of women who want the vote. 50 years ago, he wrote an essay arguing for that. He doesn't think that women are weaker, that they must be subjected to men, but he does want to listen to his wife. And his wife tells him that women shouldn't have to vote because this is not something that is going to be beneficial for them or beneficial for society. And so Lyman Abbott puts up his wife on a pedestal right away and says, I'm just telling you what my wife has convinced me of, because it's not that I'm against women, it's that I'm listening to women. And I think that here is what women are telling me and what I believe to be true about women's rights in America, in this republic, the best way that society can serve women. So he tells us that his wife has convinced him that voting is not a right, but it is a duty, that it's not a privilege that women are being refused, but it's a task that they have been exempted from in the past and that they should be exempted from in the future, and that most women want to be exempted from in the future. And he casts for us the question about women's suffrage not as women are being denied equality, women deserve the right to vote, but he tells us most women don't want to vote and shouldn't have to vote because it's a burden that would be placed on them. It wouldn't be beneficial to them, it would be harmful to them. If you look on the second page of this document, right before he says the question of women's rights, he tells us that he's asking women a question and he's asking men a question. Everybody who's reading his article. For all of the women who read his article, he says, do you really want to assume responsibility for governing not only the 80 million people in the United States, but also the millions of people in American territories, calls them colonies, or any future colonies? Do you want to have extra responsibilities on your plate? Really? And then he turns to the men and he says, hey, gentlemen, if you're reading my article, do you really want to lay a new task on women to protect people and property, something that they've never had to do before and which only a small group of them want to do now? So that's the way that he's setting up the question. Do we really want to add an extra responsibility to women? And then he goes through and he tells us, okay, why don't we consider the question of women's rights and whether or not women are wanting the right to vote. And he tells us that he has lots of evidence that women don't want to vote. He gives us a quote from an English suffragist who visited New York, who told her audience that she recognized a lot of American women don't want suffrage. They've done polls in Massachusetts and discovered that very few women who were polled said that they wanted to vote. And so Abbott tells us, hey, women don't want to vote. Maybe they're too busy, or perhaps they're too timid, or they don't like the idea of fighting. They don't want to get into a controversy, so they don't want to vote. So that's reason number one. Let's not give the vote to women because they're not really advocating for that right. Now, let me pause here for just a second and talk about whether or not he's right about this. Did women want to vote? Well, we know that a lot of them did because there is a lot of activism going on. There are a lot of suffragettes who are working to raise support and raise awareness for this across the states. But we also know that women didn't vote very actively until about the 1960s. And at that point, women started voting in larger numbers than men. In fact, ever since then, in presidential elections, women have turned out at higher rates than men. So he's maybe not entirely wrong when he says that a lot of women didn't see the need for them to vote in 1910. We can maybe give him that this wasn't a massive outcry on behalf of women. And then the question becomes, well, why? Why weren't all of them wanting to vote? We can talk about that. All right, going back to the document. Next, he says, what are the roles of men and the roles of women? I really like this part of Lyman Abbott's article. He divides life up into 4 major tasks. And he says, okay, men and women together, we have to do 4 big things. Number 1, we have to provide the material conditions of life, building houses, bridges, roads. We have to protect persons and property from wrongdoers, get the gun, shoot the bad guy, have a police force, have a military. We have to develop the character of children into, he calls it, right and noble manhood and womanhood. And then finally, we have to all aid one another in all of the first 3 steps and fix anything that we did wrong in the first 3 steps, okay? And then he gives us a nice concrete example about a pioneer man and his wife who go out into the middle of the wilderness, and they have to chop down the trees, and they have to build the cabin, and they have to hoe the field, and then they have to plant the crops. And he tells us that the man does most of that, and then the wife turns the crops into food, and she turns the I don't know what's a good, the wool into a homespun garment. She makes the house pretty. She hangs the curtains. She probably insists that he digs up a good toilet, an outhouse far away from the building. She makes it all pretty. And then when they have children, he will build the schoolhouse, but then the men in the community will hire a woman to teach the children because the men have recognized that women are naturally gifted at teaching children. Now, here I'm going to take another little aside because I read a really interesting article in the New York Times this morning about our current weird situation where everybody has to go home and stop working. And they did a survey over the last few weeks to see which parent is doing more of the homeschooling since all of the schools are out, the man or the woman. And apparently 50% of men surveyed said that they were doing most of the homeschooling. 3% of women who were polled agreed with that assessment. So the men felt as though they are doing a lot of the work when the women feel like, no, the men are not really doing the work. The women are still doing the work, homeschooling the children. I just thought that was funny. Lyman Abbott would say, of course, that's natural. Women are naturally inclined toward educating the children. That's why we hire female teachers to care for our kids. And then he would say, okay, well, so it's the woman's job to teach the children. It's the woman's job to make the house attractive and sanitary and do all of those good things. It's the man's job to protect that home and that environment. It's the man's job to build the roads, to build the house, to get the gun, to chase away the robbers. The man provides the raw material, the woman does and the administration. Should we change this? Should we really rearrange society drastically? And the way that he puts it is important. This is toward the end of his section on homemaking, governing, and educating. Lyman Abbott says, should women neglect the higher for the lower work, the more important for the less important, the end for the means, the home building and the character building for the protection of the home and the child, while the home building and the character building are carried on by others? In other words, he's asking, if women want to vote, are they saying that they want to totally change the traditional, natural, he would say, way of organizing society? Are women wanting to neglect higher work, creating good, virtuous citizens, educating children, making our homes beautiful, for the lower work, going out in the fields, doing the crops, doing the digging, building the houses? He's essentially putting women on a platform again and saying women's work is more noble. It brings more beauty, it brings more virtue, it's more valuable to society in a sense. It's a higher form of work. And if women want to vote, aren't they saying that they want to abandon all of that and come down to do the lower kind of work? Or if not, shall women add the town meeting to the mother's meeting, the work of protecting persons and property to the work of educating persons and making homes that are worth protecting? Shall she force herself to assume the tasks which have hitherto been performed by men? If she wants to keep doing all of the traditional women stuff, does she really want to add more jobs by having to be involved in politics and vote and be involved in the governing? If she doesn't, shall we men force this upon her, whether she wants it or not? This is the woman's question, and life led me to see it. Again, he reminds us, I'm being moderate. I'm not trying to be a man asserting that I want women to be subservient to me. I'm a moderate voice who's saying, this is what my wife has taught me, and I'm just listening to her wisdom. Then the next point of Abbott's argument is, if we're going to totally rearrange society, we're going to give women the right to govern and to vote, and in doing so, totally shift her out of the traditional sphere and into a new role, we really got to make sure that there's some good reason for that. And this part of Lyman Abbott's argument is where I start to get just a little bit annoyed with him, I have to confess. Because this is where I think he does some bad history. Lyman Abbott says that women are not suffering in any way under the current system. In fact, they have it pretty darn good. And so they shouldn't want anything to change. He tells us, if we give women the right to vote, we're going to be creating tension in the home, and we're going to be creating conflict where we don't need to. Right now, he tells us that no taxes are levied on women that are not levied on men, and women are undertaxed than overtaxed. Why should women want to vote when they're not being taxed unfairly? He's almost doing a no taxation without representation thing, except not very well, I think. He says, of intentional legislation by men against women and in favor of men, there is no historical evidence. And that's where he loses me. And of intentional legislation by men against women and in favor of men, there is no historical evidence. Well, at this point, women are earning less for doing the same jobs as men. Women are barred from getting certain kinds of educations, barred from certain kind of jobs, unable to serve on juries, to open a credit card until the 1970s in a lot of states. By 1900, if you were a married woman, you were allowed to keep your property. The states had changed that. But there were a lot of ways in which laws favored men over women. And I think Lyman Abbott we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he's ignorant. He hasn't talked to enough women about this. All right, then he says, it is claimed that women must be given the suffrage to protect themselves from the injustices inflicted on them by men. I confess that this claim arouses my indignation. To set class against class is bad. To set race against race is worse. To set religion against religion is even more perilous. But to set sex against sex is a degradation so deep that political polemics can no further go. Let's stop creating problems between men and women where there are no problems. Women are perfectly happy. They're not being discriminated against. And he even in the next paragraph tells us they don't need to vote so that they can get more money, because look at Black men. Black men had the right to vote for a little bit, and then Southerners took that right away. Black men can't vote in the South in 1900, but they're getting more money now than they did back in Reconstruction. So clearly the right to vote is not necessary in order to get a good wage. And then finally, Abbott goes back to his point about how women don't really want to vote. Very few, only a few hysterical suffragettes want to be able to vote, he tells us. Most women are happy not voting. And then he loses me a little bit again. This is now the section of his article called Few Sober-Minded Women Desire Suffrage. If you look right at the end of that, he says, it doesn't really, if we give women the right to vote, women's votes won't really make a difference because either they'll just vote exactly the same as their husbands will, or if they decide to vote the opposite of what their husbands want them to do, they're just going to get beaten up by their husbands. So voting is just going to either double the power of some men or it's going to increase domestic violence. The sentence where he says that is, in no small number of homes, the wife and daughters would vote as the husband and father dictated, or they would suffer consequences not to be contemplated without a shudder, is certain to anyone who knows anything of the marital relations in the so-called homes of the slums in our great cities and our mining and manufacturing towns. We need to protect women from voting because if we don't, abusive husbands are going to beat up their wives and daughters for not obeying them when it comes to casting their votes. The final portion of Abbott's article is where he says that there are a few places where women have gotten the vote already and it's not really making a difference. They're not choosing more virtuous candidates, and they seem to get tired of voting pretty quick. They're not participating in the vote at very high levels. So it hasn't produced a lot of blessings. It hasn't produced a lot of the evils that the opponents of voting wanted. So let's just leave the issue alone. This is not a change that is necessary for the American Republic. And he finishes up his article by telling us really what we need to do is allow women to become mothers. We need to allow women to exert a purifying element or purifying influence over their husbands and their sons. We need to let them give light and not heat to discussions. In other words, women, if they have the vote, will get involved in political parties. They'll become partisan, they'll become corrupt, they'll create more fire and more explosions. And we don't need that. We need them to give wisdom, direction. We need them to exert light and not heat, because they don't need to have power to influence their men. They just need to be the wives and the mothers who have love and respect and admiration. And obviously, I mean, Lyman Abbott could probably tell us, look, he's the prime example of this. His wife changed his mind about women voting. Everything that he's told us, according to Lyman Abbott, is just coming from his wife. So why corrupt women by putting them into the political arena? Why not just allow them to be exerting a good moral influence on their husbands? Okay. I think that's maybe a good place for me to stop and find out from Dr. Burkett, what about Jane Addams? How does she fit into all of this?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rogers. I appreciate that. That's a really great overview, both of the history building up to 1910 and of the argument represented by Abbott's piece here. One of my favorite. I have to chuckle a little bit at one of the things he suggests. I think is that politics often takes place in the rough and tumble of bars and saloons and things like that. And do we really want women out there in saloons and things like that? And when I read that, I have read it several times, I always think, what he's saying is he doesn't want to have to give up drinking or going out for a beer and doing politics. Women are going to ruin that for us men, right? We're going to have to follow the who was he mentioned in particular? Is it Carrie Nation? Right. So women will spoil the party.
They'll bring out their little hatchets and chop down the saloons if you let them.
The saloons, heaven forbid, right? So they're gonna ruin our good time. But he does make some serious arguments. And Jane Addams is going to respond to almost directly to his arguments. I think she makes four main points, which I'll just lay out in an overview here initially. One. Women, in fact, do want to vote, or even though the numbers are kind of low. I mean, Abbott cites a lot of numbers in terms of voter turnout for women in the 4 states where they're allowed to vote. But Addams will make the argument that women will, in fact, want to vote. That the numbers may be low now, but once their consciousnesses are, their moral consciousnesses are awakened in a way, we will see women turn out in greater and greater numbers. So she'll make that argument. We'll look at that. Second argument is to the point that this will somehow invert or subvert women's the important roles women have played in the family and producing virtuous citizens and things. And she'll argue that women don't want to give up their traditional roles. They want to keep the essential roles that they played, but it's possible for them to also venture out into the world of politics now, given circumstances. So that's the second argument she'll make. The third argument she'll make is a response to this suggestion of Abbott and others that women are represented through their husbands. She has a lot to say about that, actually. She'll say that's undemocratic. That violates a fundamental principle of democracy, really, if you think about it. One person, one vote. And we'll look at her arguments about how that's undemocratic. And then finally, fourth point, overarching argument, is why it is in fact good for women to vote, regardless of numbers, regardless of concerns about how this will affect traditional roles, so to speak, of women. It is a good thing for women to vote, and she'll make several arguments as to why that's the case. So we can look at where she makes each of those arguments here in just a minute. But I also wanted to point out, it's interesting what you have in these two pieces is in a way the views of two progressives. I think of Lyman Abbott as a kind of progressive. He's, as you pointed out, Dr. Rogers, kind of moderate progressive. Everybody in this time, around 1910, everybody wants to be called a progressive. The worst, one of the worst political insults that you can hurl at somebody at the time is to call them a reactionary or to say they're not progressive. And the response is, I'm progressive, right? Everybody's progressive. But there are shades of what it means to be a progressive at the time. I mean, generally speaking, yes, we're in favor of progress. But ironically, I think in a way, some of the arguments that Lyman Abbott makes represent a view of progressivism that is calling for radical change in some ways, perhaps, but very moderate, slow change in other respects, especially with regard to social traditions or institutions, right? The argument of a lot of progressives is, look, eventually, perhaps someday, we will get to the point when women can and should vote. But some progressives made the argument, but now is not the time. It's not necessary at this point. And to force the vote for women at this point, we sort of be getting ahead of ourselves historically, right? We're pushing it too far, and there's potentially dangerous consequences to that, but it's just not necessary yet. And I think, interestingly enough, Woodrow Wilson kind of falls into this same camp, right? I mean, he was not a strong supporter at all of women's suffrage, and his basic argument was essentially the same arguments that Abbott makes. It's just not necessary, and to do it would be to force a social change upon us that we're just not prepared for. We'll get there eventually, but not yet. So a lot of times it's sort of it's not yet, right? Maybe eventually. Eventually. So interestingly enough, Lyman Abbott is that type of progressive. He's moderate in certain ways. Jane Addams, of course, is also a progressive, very famous progressive, but a progressive of a different sort. And I think what distinguishes Jane Addams and therefore gives her arguments a lot of credibility is the fact that she's known as a on the ground, feet on the ground, hands on progressive who is trying to affect real change by doing real work in her community and the communities that she's working in. She's most famous, of course, for her work at Hull House, working in Chicago, and really trying to find practical progressive solutions to the problems of urbanization. Right? She's really famous for, really well known for trying to working with real people, seeing firsthand, hearing the stories of mothers who are struggling to keep their families healthy, to educate their families well. She's very familiar with stories about young women who feel lost in the big cities. You have to remember too, big cities are a relatively new thing. They're a product of rapid industrialization in the last part of the 19th century. And so in a relatively short time, you have massive numbers of people coming to live together in relatively small places, right? And it leads to overcrowding. It leads to sanitation issues. It leads to a lot of these young people, by the way, in these cities are also working in factories. So it's not like it used to be in the old days when they were on the farm and mom and dad taught them the virtues of hard work and sort of keeping their nose to the grindstone, and they were raised in a very strict moral way in some ways, right? A lot of those opportunities are lost. So young women are dealing with problems of abuse at the hands of men. Prostitution is on the rise. Drug use is on the rise. Alcoholism, especially in the cities. Venereal disease, I shouldn't laugh, but all these problems that come from people living close together, right, are on the rise. Young men are forming gangs. They're unhappy with their home lives and with work, so they form gangs as a way to vent their frustrations. And there's a real problem, especially with the young, in terms of relationships, dating, right? Unwed pregnancies, really early pregnancies. I mean, these are the kinds of things Jane Addams is dealing with on the ground, right? And she's setting up programs to help real people with these problems, to educate them, to teach them how to deal with them through her programs like Hull House, educational programs. So she's witnessing these things firsthand, and I think her experiences as a progressive in that sense really inform her calls for expanding suffrage to women, because women are the ones who are, especially mothers, right? As she says, are really the ones faced with the difficulties of raising children in these new circumstances, and they have a lot to say with regard to the kinds of politics and policies that can help them do a better job in raising families and raising their children. So I think that gives her perspective on things that others don't quite have. And again, perhaps why her arguments are considered, to be quite powerful and taken quite seriously by quite a few people. Um, so her first argument is, again, in response to Lyman Abbott, who argues women don't really want the vote. I mean, she begins um, by by pointing out, look, it may be true that in terms of turnout, the numbers aren't great, but women are just sort of awakening. You have to take time into consideration here, right? As she says right in the second paragraph of this piece, this paper is an attempt to show that many women today are failing to discharge their duties to their own households properly simply because they do not perceive that as society grows more complicated, it is necessary that women shall extend her sense of responsibility to many things outside of her own home if she would continue to preserve the home in its entirety. Um, in other words, as women come to realize that how much in modern times public policies with regard to health, food, education, when women more fully and widely recognize the influence those things have on her ability to raise her family, they will want to be more involved over time in politics. So as women become more aware of the connection of these things, you will see the increase in the women's interest in voting. In short, women would keep on with her old business. This is at the end of that second paragraph. If women would keep on with her old business of caring for her house and rearing her children, she will have to have some conscience in regard to public affairs lying quite outside of her immediate household. The individual conscience and devotion are no longer effective. So interestingly enough, I think one of her main arguments at the beginning is it's precisely because women have remained so dedicated to their traditional roles as of raising children and taking care of a household. They're so dedicated to that, and that's a good thing for Addams, that they just don't yet see or haven't had the opportunity to see the connection or the influence that politics or public affairs actually have, the effect those have on her ability to do that job well. As they come to see that, more and more interested in voting will vote. She gives several examples of this, right? In the very next paragraph, in Chicago, uh, uh, they had nurses in schools, and then there was an outbreak of contagion of scarlet fever, right? But the school nurses had been discontinued. She says because businessmen had pronounced them too expensive. If the women who sent their children to the schools had been sufficiently public spirited and had been provided with an implement through which to express the public spirit, they would have insisted that the schools be supplied with nurses in order that their own children might be protected from contagion. In other words, if women would effectively continue their old avocations, they must take part in the slow upbuilding of legislation which alone is sufficient to protect the home from the dangers incident to modern life. And Addams, she intertwines this argument that women will become more and more conscious of the importance of political affairs on home life. She intertwines that with her arguments, again, contra Lyman Abbott, that women actually don't want to give up their traditional responsibilities in managing households and families. So her argument, she mixes those two arguments to create a larger argument, which is in order for women to do their jobs, so to speak, of their household jobs, or fulfill their household responsibilities better, they must become more political, and that means giving them the vote. So there are a number of examples throughout this piece where Jane Addams articulates that very nicely. If I can find another um, place where she says that. As I'm looking for things, she mentions, for example, that in a lot of places, um, a lot of people recognize the influence of women on education. And yet, it's strange that we find so few places where women are allowed to be elected to boards of education, right? In order to influence school curriculum, school policies, and things like that. I'm looking for a particular passage here, I think. Yeah, I'm looking. it's toward the end of this document a little bit. She says, if I can find it right at the beginning. Why haven't more women been um, more sort of vociferous in demanding voting rights for women? And she says, Addams writes, that she has not done so is doubtless due to the fact that her conscience is slow to recognize any obligation outside of her own family circle. And because she was so absorbed in her own household that she failed to see what the conditions outside actually were. It would be interesting to know how far the consciousness that she had no vote and could not change matters operated in this direction. After all, we see only those things to which our attention has been drawn. We feel responsibility for those things which are brought to us as matters of responsibility. If conscientious women were convinced that it was a civic duty to be informed in regard to these grave industrial affairs, and then to express the conclusions which they had reached by depositing a piece of paper in a ballot box, one cannot imagine that they would shirk simply because the action ran counter to old traditions. So that's a pretty direct response to Lyman Abbott's argument, right? As women become more aware of these things, they will want to vote for more. So again, Addams' overarching argument is women don't want to give up their traditional responsibilities, although she does mention that there are a lot of things women had to do in the past that they know that technology has allowed them to, has sort of lifted the burden right off of women in terms of making clothes, food supply, things like this. Women actually are less burdened in some ways in this time. Um, but women don't want to give up their traditional roles. In order to do their traditional roles better, they need to have access to the public sphere, to have influence on public policy, on laws that affect the health and the safety and the morals of everyone, including their own families. Her other argument about in response to Abbott about women are kind of represented through their husbands. She picks up toward the end of this piece. Let me see if I can find it. She talks about a friend that she knew, where who was talking about the influence that wives could have on their husbands when they would go to vote. It's in this paragraph. To those of my readers who would admit that although women has no right to shirk her own obligations, if you go down in that paragraph, she says, "I'd like to tell a little story." So she tells a story about a conversation she had about that women with somebody, I think a woman, who said that wives can influence their husbands, their vote, and therefore women kind of are represented. Addams writes, my friend said that for many years she had suspected that women could influence men only in regard to those things in which men were not deeply concerned. But when it came to persuading a man to a woman's view in affairs of politics or business, it was absolutely useless. I contended that a woman had no right to persuade a man to vote against his own convictions. This, to me, is the really interesting argument she makes. Addams is saying women shouldn't try to influence how their husbands vote. Why? She says, I respected the men of her family for following their own judgment, regardless of the appeal which the honored head of the house had made to their chivalric devotion. To this she replied that she would agree with that point of view when a woman had the same opportunity as a man to register her conviction by vote. I believed then, as I do now, that nothing is gained when independence of judgment is assailed by influence, sentimental or otherwise, and that we test advancing civilization somewhat by our power to respect differences and by our tolerance of another's honest conviction. So what she's saying, in a way, she's defending the importance of voting, of every individual voting. You should vote your conscience. And for a husband to vote not based on his conscience, but because of the influence of another, even if it's his wife, is somehow a violation of the fundamental idea of democracy or voting, right? And of course, all the more reason Addams argues for allowing women to have their own vote. Let men have their own vote, let women have their own vote. Let them vote as individuals with their own views, with their own opinions, and based upon what they deeply believe in as important. So I found that to be a very, very interesting argument on the part of Addams. And then she concludes as a summary of all of these arguments in the last paragraph. Public-spirited women who wish to use the ballot, as I know them, do not wish to do the work of men, nor to take over men's affairs. They simply want an opportunity to do their own work and to take care of those affairs which naturally and historically belong to women, but which are constantly being overlooked and slighted in our political institutions. In a complex community like the modern city, all points of view need to be represented. The resultants of diverse experiences need to be pooled if the community would make for sane and balanced progress. Right? So it's the difficulties of the modern city, the challenges of modern city life have really changed how we need to think about who should vote, right? According to Addams. And then she sort of takes one more point here toward the end, and she says, look, women have traditionally wanted to keep their homes healthy and beautiful. That's been their traditional function, she says, right? To make their dwelling place both clean and fair. Women, therefore, can have a very strong influence in trying to make their city both clean and safe, or healthful and beautiful, right? So she ends by pointing out how giving women an influence in politics is a natural extension of how women think about their responsibilities in the family and the household. So I know it's a quick overview of her argument, but again, I find it fascinating that she really is trying to argue point by point almost with Lyman Abbott's argument. So, and by the way, I forgot to mention earlier, if you have questions, please send us questions in the chat box. We're happy to take any questions that you have. So, Dr. Rogers, I'm curious, do you think Addams' argument is a good response to Abbott? Or, I don't know, what do you think?
I think so. I find it very interesting that both of them find common ground in the idea that women's sphere is different than men's sphere, and that women have a unique perspective on issues that men will fail to recognize. So Addams, is particularly pointing out, based on her extensive experience living in inner city Chicago, women are the ones who notice sick babies because of dirty milk. Women are the ones who notice children with scarlet fever. Women are the ones who are, in the day-to-day care and upbringing of children in particular, and she mentions working conditions in factories for teenage girls whose future reproductive years will be damaged if their health is not cared for when they work in factories. These are all well within the traditional sphere that Lyman Abbott argues women should occupy. These are all taking care of, making the house look better and educating the children and doing all of those nurturing things. She's not disagreeing with him about that. She's just saying to him, Mr. Abbott, Reverend Abbott, women's consciences have not yet been pricked. They have not yet realized how much care they should be taking outside of their own homes for their larger community. And if they have the ability to vote, it will actually increase their own moral responsibility. It'll increase their capacity to care about their society, because then they'll be responsible for it. And they'll bring their unique feminine perspective in a way that will benefit the entire nation. She's taking the Republican motherhood argument and she's combining it, not with it necessarily even an equality argument, but she's saying, yes, let's let women act in the way that we all recognize naturally gender roles lead them to act, but let's also give them the right to vote that a democracy should be allowing them. It should be ensuring for them. I wanted to just point out one great irony about this whole situation. So Jane Addams says women are not represented by their husbands, and she tells that wonderful story about her friend who tried to convince her husband and her sons to please not vote for this presidential candidate, and the best she could do was her one son agreed to just not vote at all. So he threw his vote away for his mom. And I love her argument. I agree. I think this is a strong one. She says everybody should vote his or her own conscience. We shouldn't let women try to just, be the neck that turns the head, as they say in My Big Fat Greek Wedding too. But, so ironic moment, the vote that ratified the 19th Amendment. So in Tennessee was the last state that was necessary to ratify the amendment that would give women the constitutional right to vote. And Tennessee was just neck and neck on this. And it looked as though they were not going to ratify the amendment. Women were not going to get the suffrage. And then a 24-year-old man named Harry Burns at the last second changed his vote. And the mob almost killed him. He had to run out of the building as soon as the vote was over, because he had just, with his one vote, made ratification possible. Turns out he did it because his mother sent him a letter. And in that letter, she said, be a good boy and vote to ratify the amendment. And so he did. So I love that it's just kind of one last moment where we see some influence from the maternal coming through to the political sphere. And in this case, it actually ends up giving women the right to vote for themselves.
It's a great story. I love the fact that he did it because he loved his mother too. I love it when sons love their mother. That's fantastic. And it's interesting because too, I love how you started by going back to the founding and talking about the various views and how things sort of emerged in the 19th century where women didn't vote. But there was an initial argument among the arguments against women voting at the time of the founding and the early republic. There were, by the way, as you mentioned, instances of women voting. There were people who argued that certain women with property, for example, should be able to vote, and so on and so forth, right? So there were mixed views on this, but the majority were not necessarily in favor of women voting. One argument against women voting at the time was, this is back at the time of the American founding, is that if you give women a vote, they would just vote the way their husbands told them to vote. So that would be like giving the husbands 2 votes. So married men would essentially be, given an extra political advantage, right? So that's undemocratic, was the argument at the time of the founding.
And Abbott says exactly the same thing. He repeats that totally and says that they'll just double the vote of their husbands.
Yeah. And I love how Addams totally inverts that in a way by saying women shouldn't influence the votes of men, right? Because even to a certain extent, because that's not what voting is to her. Voting means an individual votes on their own conscience, and any external influence on how somebody votes, really, whether it's from a husband or a wife or bosses, right? It was still common practice for employers to try to get their workers to force them to vote a certain way, and all of this. That's all undemocratic from Addams' point. So she takes that earlier argument and elevates it to a new level that's put in the service of, again, this is why men and women each, husbands and wives each, should have their own votes. So
yeah. And she doesn't try to argue that women are more moral than men. She respects the rights of both genders to make their own moral decisions, and in that way, I think, is more true to the values of the founding than what Abbott is ultimately. Looks like we have a question in the chat box. No, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say quickly before we Addams, again, I like your point. She's not saying men or the views of women are going to replace or be superior to men, but she's acknowledging that men, again, there are differences. Men typically they view politics from a certain perspective. And it's largely from a business perspective. Men have a business-like mentality, right? In a certain sense. That is, they're thinking about, economic things in a big picture, or, they think about profits, efficiency. They have this business mindset. But we all know from the progressive era that what falls to the wayside is safety, consumer safety, and all these sorts of health issues that
Right.
Addams and women traditionally seem to be much more concerned with. So.
You could probably argue that continues to the current day, that's one of the reasons why women tend to vote Democrat more than Republican.
Yeah. This is a great question from, is it Lee? I hope I pronounced it correctly. Do you want me to read it? The idea that a
Yes,
large
please.
amount of women's suffrage came from the Industrial Revolution and the rise of cities is fascinating. Is there any comparison between the arguments that Abbott and Abbots were making in 1910 and the situation in the Lowell mills in Massachusetts in the 1840s? That's a great question. Do you have any thoughts on this, Dr. Rogers?
Well, we know that the Seneca Falls Convention was 1848. And I wonder if you could make the case that one of the reasons why women were advocating for a lot of women in 1848, they just wanted more rights. And then some of them went all the way and said, and we want to vote. And I think that you could definitely make a case that the reason why they're doing that in the 1840s is because they are leaving that traditional sphere of just being in the home all the time, and they're experiencing factory life. They're being more active participants in this market economy. The conditions are changing for them, and that does maybe make them more politically aware or cause them to see more of a need to become politically involved. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think that was a great. I agree with everything you just said. I mean, the Lowell mills. It's one example of many, right? But it's maybe the most famous example of women engaging and therefore realizing the effects of industrialization on workers in general, not just women in the workplace, but workers and the conditions that workers have to face. And as women get more and more involved in industrial activities, they come to see pretty clearly that there are a lot of unsafe, unhealthy conditions that workers are facing, and for very, very low wages. So from the late 1840s, really into the 1850s too, but they really start to see how industrialization is changing so many things and creating sort of new problems that didn't have to deal with before, but now we have to deal with them because they're here as a result of industrialization, and we have to find solutions to them. So, and I think again that does carry over into what Jane Addams is seeing. She's dealing with cities, which are themselves the results of industrialization, right? So,
Right.
the earlier in the 1840s and 50s, women are noticing the new problems of industrialization. Addams is dealing with the consequences of industrialization in the form of large urban areas. So,
Yeah. Charlotte asks, is there anything that you think should have been added to either argument? My answer to that would be, I think I mentioned one of the areas where Lyman Abbott, I disagreed with him a little bit. I felt like he was ignoring some history when he said that women had not been discriminated against in any laws that had been made by men. And funnily enough, Jane Addams doesn't make that case either. Neither one of them addresses things like women's rights to keep their own property or to open a bank account without permission from a male relative, or kind of the equal pay, the right to, there were not at this point laws about preventing marital rape. So the idea was that once you got married, you had consented to everything forever and could never complain about anything. So neither of them deal with those equality arguments that are so obvious to us and important to us today, let alone, birth control. They're very much focused on the traditional perspective of morality and gender roles, and just disagreeing about whether or not voting is going to make society better or not from the perspective of staying within traditional gender roles. And I don't necessarily think that they should have added that to their arguments. I think it just shows us that that's not where the movement was in the 1910s. That wasn't their priority. That maybe wouldn't have been convincing to enough people to really make a change. So, yeah.
great point. There's one more question. Maybe we can take one more. Somebody asked, can we talk about the role of African American women in the voting rights efforts and whether they were included, excluded at this time? And based on what I know about it at the time, again in the early 1900s, there were in fact quite a few African American women pushing for women's suffrage because they've been waiting, 40, 50 years since the 15th Amendment uh, right? In a way, that's a fascinating story in itself. Why did the 15th Amendment again? It prevents states from discriminating against men, or preventing men from voting, right, based on sex, uh, but on race. I'm sorry, but it doesn't say anything about sex or gender, right? So that's a fascinating story, and it involves, Fred Douglass is at one time a great champion of allowing women to vote, but there's some politics at the time that end up, hate to say it, but women kind of get thrown under the bus in order to guarantee the right of black males to vote. And so for another 50 years, 40 something years, what about us? So African American women, and there's some great stories of individuals who are spearheading this. They're involved. They're working with Jane Addams, by the way, and others who are spearheading the new NAACP, as you mentioned, Dr. Rogers at the time. But unfortunately, again, they make very little headway um, in terms of. Well, let me put it this way. There are, among African American women, there are some who want the right to vote for women just for the sake of equal suffrage for women. There are others who are bundling it together with the larger question of civil rights. And if you study this period, it's a very tragic period, I think, in the missed opportunities to advance civil rights for African Americans as a whole, right? In this country, it's a very disappointing time for people like Du Bois and a lot of others, because they saw this moment, the 1910s especially, as a great moment, a great opportunity to not just give women the right to vote, but to make great advances in terms of equal civil rights for African Americans as a whole, including women. And of course, that doesn't happen. There are a number of setbacks. Don't get me started on Woodrow Wilson and others. But the short of it is, there are a number of African American women who play very important roles. And I'm sorry, I'm not thinking of particular names off the top of my head.
Ida B. Wells would be a good one.
Well, that's a fantastic person. Yeah, Ida Wells.
And they weren't shy about, like, in 1913 there was this great march in Washington D.C. For women's rights, and the leaders of the march asked the black women to vote at the back, or to go to the back of the parade, and some of these women said, no, we're not going to do that. And
that's right. Great stories of courage. And again, there were some people pushing for women's suffrage who thought that again, it didn't help their cause to have African American women out in the forefront. So that's an unfortunate side of the politics of the thing, right? But a lot of them were not deterred by that. So again, Ida Wells, I don't know why I didn't think of her. That's a great example. She's a fascinating character. So
yeah, I think that's one of the most powerful criticisms of President Woodrow Wilson. He was arguing that other nations should be allowed to have democracy and freedom, and yet in America he was notoriously bad on women's suffrage and on race. And I think that's one of the reasons why the 19th Amendment was able to get pushed through, was because the First World War really made that hypocrisy on his part come into really stark relief, and suffragettes were able to use that to push him to support the 19th Amendment.
Yeah, in a very lukewarm way, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm resisting the urge to launch against Woodrow Wilson here, but anyway. Well, thank you very much. That was fun. Thank you, Dr.
That was fun. Yes.
Enjoy our conversations, and thanks for the questions.
My pleasure.
Thanks to both of you guys for talking with us today. Thanks to all of you who came. Just a reminder, we will be posting this video on YouTube within a few days here, and on the Teaching American History YouTube channel we have. And for any of you who have enjoyed this and are interested in maybe earning some college credit this summer, we do have our Ashbrook Academy, which is normally held on our campus, but we'll be doing it online this summer. So if you want to have more conversations like this and earn a little college credit, visit ashbrookacademy.org and look into applying for that. Our application deadline is June 5th, so please get on that soon. Otherwise, we'll see you back here next week if you can join us then. Same day, Thursday at 3 o'clock. Our topic next week will be the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. So thanks to all of you who came. We'll see you next week.